She'd been sitting at the edge of the driveway for hours, but last night she brought someone with her. Not a person, not another cat. A dog, small, brown, with a face that looked far too serious for his size, standing just a step behind her, as if he'd been told to wait there. I froze in the doorway, mug of tea in my hands cooling far too quickly. It was late October, the kind of night where the air feels thinner, sharper, and every sound carries a little further. Dry leaves scraped across the road. Somewhere down the block, a screen door banged, in the wind. And on my driveway, a blind cat I'd been quietly watching for weeks, and her strange little companion, waiting like they'd been sent for me. You're here, listening. And that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. I'd first noticed her a month ago, just after the weather had started to turn. Back then, it was just her. Pale gray fur, ears flicking in the cold, moving in hesitant, careful arcs like she was mapping the world with her whiskers. She never ran, never darted like the other strays. She moved slow, almost deliberate, pausing every few steps to angle her head in the direction of a sound. The first night I saw her, I thought she was injured. The second, I thought maybe she belonged to someone down the street. By the third, I knew. She couldn't see. It wasn't obvious at first, and her eyes were open, pale like mist, but they didn't fix on things. When a car passed, she didn't look. When a squirrel darted across the road, she didn't follow. Her ears did all the work, swiveling toward every crackle of a branch or shuffle of a shoe. It had been a strange, heavy year in the house. Too many quiet dinners, too many empty mornings where I'd forget why I'd woken up early in the first place. The kind of grief that doesn't scream, but hums in the background. Steady, unrelenting. I'd lost my dad, in March. Then, just 3 months later, Daisy, the golden retriever who'd been part of this family for nearly 12 years, and with her went the last bit of warmth in the house. Now, most nights I'd sit at the kitchen table with the lights low, the radio turned down to a whisper, just letting the silence settle around me. That's when she started coming. The first few nights, she lingered near the hedge, almost invisible, in the dark, then a little closer, sitting by the cracked paving stone near the mailbox. Always quiet, always still. Like she knew this wasn't the kind of place where you rushed things. By the second week, I'd started leaving a small bowl of food near the porch. Not right at the top. I didn't want to scare her, but far enough from the street that she could eat without worrying about passing cars. Sometimes she came, sometimes she didn't. When she did, she ate in these small, careful bites, pausing between each one to listen. To me, to the street, to the rustle of the branches overhead. She never let me touch her, never even let me get close enough to try. But I could feel something shifting, slow as the season. Last night changed everything. The dog appeared first, small, wiry-haired, with a little white blaze on his chest and a tail that curled in a perfect loop. He didn't look like he belonged to anyone on this street. His coat was dusty, his nails too long, but his eyes, sharp, alert, and they weren't watching me. They were watching her. She followed him up the driveway in those same hesitant steps I'd seen for weeks, nose twitching, head tilting toward the sound of his paws on the concrete. When she stopped, he stopped. When she turned her head, he moved to her side. Not touching, just close enough that she could sense him there. It was the strangest, gentlest thing I'd ever seen. The wind was colder than I'd expected. I pulled my sweater tighter, setting the tea down on the step. She seemed more relaxed tonight, her tail low, her body angled toward the sound of my movements instead of away from them. The dog sat beside her, eyes flicking between me and the street. Like a guard, I crouched slowly, trying to make myself smaller. Her ears flicked. The dogs didn't move at all. I didn't say anything. Not yet. Something told me this moment wasn't mine to rush. It hit me then. How quiet the street had become. Even the leaves had stopped scraping. All I could hear was her soft breathing and the faint shuffle of her paw against the concrete as she adjusted her stance. She was blind, and he was her eyes. I thought about Daisy then, about the way she used to slow down when my dad's legs started to give him trouble. The way she'd walk just half a step ahead, pausing whenever he paused, looking back over her shoulder to make sure he was still coming. I didn't know this dog. I didn't know this cat. But I knew what I was seeing. And for the first time in months, I felt something stir under the weight of all that quiet. That's when she did it. The thing that told me this wasn't just another stray cat story. She stepped forward, one slow, careful paw, then another. The dog didn't move, just waited. And when she reached the edge of the first porch step, she stopped and faced me directly. Her eyes, clouded, unseeing, found my voice when I whispered, "It's okay." The dog's tail wagged once, just once, and somehow, I knew this was the beginning of something I wasn't ready for but desperately needed. The first morning after they came together, I expected them to be gone. Strays don't wait for you. They take what's given, food, shelter, warmth, and vanish before you've even had the chance to notice how much you missed them. But when I opened the front door, there they were. Not at the driveway this time. On the porch. The dog sat, halfway up the steps, front paws square, ears tilted toward me. The cat, she was curled beside him, her body pressed into the wood, nose angled toward the smell of the open air. She didn't startle, didn't get up and retreat like before. It was still early, sun barely lifting over the row of houses, a thin gold light stretching long shadows across the street. The air was cool enough that I could see my breath when I stepped out. The dog watched me the way Daisy used to watch squirrels. Still, but with a focus so sharp, it felt like it could cut through anything between us. The cat just listened. Her ears flicked toward the sound of my footsteps, her nose twitching once, twice as if committing my scent to memory. I went back inside, heart beating a little faster than it should have for such a small thing, and came out with the bowl. Same place as before, a foot from the top step. She didn't move. The dog looked at the bowl, then at her, then back at me. A silent conversation I wasn't part of passed between them. Then he stood, walked to the bowl, sniffed it, and stepped back. He wasn't eating. He was waiting for her. She rose slowly, her paws feeling out the boards, beneath her. One step forward. A pause. Another step, her whiskers brushing the side of the bowl before she bent her head and began to eat. Her body relaxed as she chewed, the soft crunch of kibble sounding louder in the stillness than it should have. The dog sat close, not looking at the food, not looking at me, just keeping watch. When she finished, she didn't run. She sat down again, tail curling neatly around, her feet, and for the first time I saw her lift her chin slightly, like she was turning her face toward the warmth of the rising sun. It was such a small thing, but it made something inside me ache in a way I hadn't expected. That became our first routine. Morning, a bowl of food at the top of the steps, her slow approach, his watchful presence. They didn't come every day. Sometimes, a week would pass without them. But when they did appear, I'd find myself moving a little quicker through the kitchen, a little less aware of the heaviness in my chest, as if I was afraid of missing them. By the second month, patterns began to form. She would arrive first, nose to the ground, tracing the edge of the driveway in small, careful arcs. Then a minute later he would follow, almost trotting, ears bouncing as though catching up after making sure the way was clear. When she stopped, he stopped. When she turned her head toward a sound, his eyes went there too. They were bound by something I couldn't name but could feel. I started talking to them, at first just quiet greetings when I stepped outside, then little half-sentences like I was, narrating my movements so she wouldn't be startled. "All right, food's coming. Careful. Steps right there. Wind's cold this morning, isn't it?" I knew she didn't understand the words, but animals understand tone. And maybe, I thought she could feel the warmth in mine. It was a rainy afternoon when the first real shift happened. The kind of rain that smells like wet pavement and copper, that seeps into your sleeves before you've even locked the door behind you. They were on the porch again, both damp but not shivering, tucked into the corner where the wind couldn't reach. I set the food down inside the doorway this time, so it wouldn't get wet. She hesitated. Her ears flicked toward me, then toward the dog, as if waiting for some unspoken cue. He stepped forward first, paws tapping lightly on the boards, then stopped just beside the bowl. She followed, moving slower than ever, paws slipping slightly on the wet wood. Halfway there, she stopped, and for the first time she lowered herself onto her belly, not because she was scared, but because she was waiting for me to move closer. I crouched, my knees pressing into the cool floorboards, and extended my hand, not touching, just resting it there, palm open a few inches away. She sniffed the air, whiskers trembling, a pause that felt like it stretched forever. Then, the faintest brush of fur against my fingertips. Not a full nuzzle, just the kind of touch that says, I know you're here. I'm not ready yet, but I know. Her fur was damp from the rain, carrying that earthy smell cats get when they've been outside too long. I kept my hand still, letting her pull away when she wanted. The dog stayed beside her the whole time, his eyes never leaving me. Have you ever had an animal wait for you even when you didn't ask them to? That's what it felt like in that moment, like they'd both been waiting for me to be ready too. From then on, she didn't flinch when I stepped outside. If I spoke softly, she'd tilt her head toward me. If I stayed quiet, she'd still know I was there. The dog began taking small liberties too. Quick sniff of my shoes when I set the bowl down. A brief wag of his tail if I said good boy under my breath. They were still strangers in many ways, never staying long, never crossing the threshold into the house. But the porch had become ours. One evening, as the last of the daylight drained from the sky, I came out to find them sitting closer than I'd ever seen, not just side by side, touching. Her body leaning lightly into his, her nose tucked near his shoulder. She was grooming herself in slow, unhurried movements, pausing now and then to adjust her balance. He didn't move away, didn't even look at her. It was the kind of easy closeness that only comes when trust has already been earned. And I realized, in the quiet of that porch, under the thin crescent moon, that they had never once asked me for anything. No meowing at the door, no pawing for treats, just showing up. The more I watched them, the more I noticed how he adjusted himself to her. If she moved toward the steps, he'd circle ahead of her, blocking the edge with his body until she turned. If she stopped suddenly, he'd pause too, ears flicking to whatever sound had caught hers. He didn't lead her by force, he just made it easier for her to move through the world. By the end of winter, she was letting me sit on the porch with them while she ate. Not close enough to touch, not yet, but close enough that I could feel the heat from her small body in the cold air. The dog sometimes lay down during these moments, resting his chin on his paws, eyes half closed but always alert. If another animal passed, a raccoon, a stray tomcat, he'd be on his feet in an instant, standing between them and her. I found myself wondering about their story, where they'd come from, how they'd found each other, and why, out of all the porches in the neighborhood, they'd chosen mine. I didn't know the answers, but I knew this. Every time they left, the space they left behind felt heavier than before. The first time she brushed her side fully against my leg, it caught me off guard. It was early morning, frost still clinging to the grass, the air so cold it made my fingers ache. I'd stepped out with the bowl, and she'd approached without hesitation. Halfway to the food, she veered slightly, and her body slid gently along the side of my calf. It lasted less than 2 seconds, but it was enough to make my throat tighten, because in her world, a world without sight, built on sound and scent and trust, That was the loudest way she could say, "I know you now, and maybe I need you too." It started with the way she would pause. Not just any pause. I'd seen her stop before, plenty of times. She was a blind cat. Pauses were part of how she mapped her world. But this was different. She'd step onto the porch like normal, the dog trailing behind. I'd greet them softly, set the bowl down, watch her nose twitch toward the smell. And then, just as she was about to eat, she'd stop mid-step and turn her head toward the far right corner of the yard. Not a quick flick of her ears like when a branch snapped or a car rolled by. This was deliberate. Her body would go still, muscles tight, tail low, and her ears would tilt just enough to catch something. The dog noticed it too. At first, he'd glance that way, ears forward, nose flaring. Then, over the next few days, I realized he was starting to position himself between her and that corner, like a wall. The corner itself was nothing special. A narrow patch of grass where the fence met the side hedge. The kind of spot you'd ignore if you weren't the one mowing it. In summer, the hedge grew so thick you could barely see the ground beneath. In winter, like now, it was bare, twisted branches scratching the wind, a scattering of damp leaves. Pressed against the fence boards, I didn't see anything there. No movement. No shapes in the shadows, just empty space. But she kept staring. The first week, it happened once or twice. By the second week, it was every visit. Sometimes she'd stare for only a few seconds before turning back to her food. Other times, she'd stand there so long I'd think she'd forgotten why she came. The dog's reaction grew sharper too. His tail no longer wagged when we greeted each other. His posture stayed stiff, ready, until she'd finished eating and he'd walked her back down the driveway. I tried to brush it off. Strays notice things we don't. Scents, sounds, traces of other animals. Maybe a raccoon had been through. Maybe another cat. But the way she lingered on that corner like it was pulling her attention no matter how she tried to turn away, it unsettled me. One night, I stayed outside longer than usual. The air had that strange, in-between temperature, not warm enough to be comfortable, not cold enough to bite, and the wind smelled faintly of wood smoke from somewhere down the street. She was eating. The dog was lying beside her, chin on his paws, but his eyes were half closed in that fake sleep animals do when they're actually listening for danger, and then, right on cue, she stopped. Her head lifted, ears angled toward the corner. The dog was up instantly. I followed her gaze, or, well, the line her unseeing eyes pointed toward, and squinted into the dark. Nothing. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized I could hear something, not loud, not obvious, a faint tapping, or maybe scratching. It was uneven. A couple of soft ticks, a pause, then another faint sound like something brushing the fence. It could have been the hedge moving in the wind, but there wasn't enough wind for that. I didn't move closer that night. Something about the way the dog planted himself between her and the corner told me I shouldn't, but I didn't sleep easily. The next day I decided to test something. When they arrived, I set the bowl on the far left side of the porch, opposite the corner. She followed her usual routine. Slow, careful steps, nose tracking the scent of food. She found it, ate for a minute, then stopped. Head up, ears tilting, toward the same corner even though she was facing away from it. The dog moved again. Same position, same silent guard. "If you two are trying to tell me something," I muttered under my breath, "you're doing a terrible job." The dog didn't even flick an ear at my voice. Around this time, my own life was shifting. Work hours had been cut back, bills were stacking, and there was a letter on the kitchen counter I'd been avoiding opening, from the insurance company, about my dad's estate. Part of me feared that soon I might not even be living here. The thought of leaving this porch, and the quiet, steady rhythm these two had brought to it, was heavier than I'd expected, which made the corner all the more maddening. Because whatever it was, I felt like I needed to understand it, before time ran out. 3 nights later, I made up my mind. They'd come early, just before sunset. The sky was still faintly blue, streaked with pink near the horizon. The air was calm. She was eating. The dog was watching the street. And then, there it was. The pause, the turn of her head. But this time, her body moved too. She stepped away from the bowl. Slowly, tentatively, her paws feeling for the edge of the porch. The dog moved in front of her, blocking the steps. She stopped, tilted her head as if listening to him, and then, very slightly, shifted sideways toward the corner. I found myself holding my breath. Every instinct told me to stay still, not to break whatever unspoken process was happening between them. The dog didn't growl, didn't bark, but his body was rigid, muscles taut. She moved another step. He followed. It was a strange dance, her drifting toward that bare patch of hedge, him shadowing every move like a silent tether, and then she stopped, not in fear, not in surprise, but like she had arrived. Her nose lifted, her ears flicked forward, catching something I couldn't hear. And then, so quietly I almost missed it, she meowed. It was the first sound I'd ever heard from her. A small, rough-edged note, like a question whispered through a closed door. The dog stepped in front of her fully now, blocking her view of the corner entirely. She didn't protest, just stayed there, tail wrapped around her paws, head angled toward him like she was listening to some private reassurance. After a long minute, they both turned back toward me. The moment was over. I couldn't shake it. Why that spot? Why every time? And why had she, a cat who seemed to navigate her life in near silence, chosen that moment to speak? Later that night, lying in bed, I thought about something my dad used to say. You don't have to see the whole thing to know there's something there. Sometimes you just have to trust what's looking for you too. I didn't know what she'd been looking for in that corner, but I knew this. She wasn't alone in the search. If this gentle story brought even a tiny smile or calm to your heart, would you consider subscribing? It helps me keep sharing these soft moments for you and for anyone who needs peace tonight. When they came the next evening, I was ready. Not to solve the mystery, not yet, but to follow it. Because whatever that corner meant to her, it wasn't random, and something told me I was going to find out why. The night it happened, the sky looked heavier than usual. Not storm heavy, not yet, but with that thick, low weight that makes you think the clouds are holding something back. The air was damp, cold enough to numb your fingertips if you stood outside too long. I'd left the porch light off on purpose, thinking maybe, just maybe, the dark would let me see whatever she kept hearing. They arrived later than normal, the dog first, trotting up the driveway with his head low, tail not wagging. The cat followed in her steady, deliberate way, paws brushing over the concrete, her ears already turned toward the corner before she even reached the steps. It was like she knew it would be one of those nights. I greeted them softly, voice low. No bowl yet. Not until I saw where this was going. The dog came closer to me than usual, his shoulder almost brushing my leg. It wasn't affection. It felt more like he was making sure I was with them. The cat, though, she didn't wait for my cue. She turned toward the far side of the porch, her paws moving faster than I'd ever seen her go. Not running, but with purpose, like she'd already decided there was no point hesitating. The dog darted, in front of her, blocking her path, but she pressed against his side, pushing gently as if saying, "Not this time." I stepped forward. The boards creaked under my weight, and for a moment both of them froze. Then she moved again, and the dog let her pass. By now, I'd learned how to read the way her body shifted. Every muscle was alert. Her tail hovered just above the ground. She was listening, or numb, but not in fear. This was recognition. I followed slowly, my boots thudding softly against the boards. The dog stayed behind me now, his paws making almost no sound. I could feel his eyes on my back, like he was making sure I didn't get too close without understanding what I was walking toward. The corner looked the same as always. Bare hedge branches, damp leaves, a fence that had seen better days, no movement, no shapes. But then I heard it. Faint, rhythmic. A soft, irregular scratching, like claws on wood. It stopped as soon as I noticed it. The silence afterward felt heavier than the sound itself. She stepped right up to the edge of the porch, her paws on the very last board before the drop to the grass. Her nose lifted, whiskers trembling. And then she made that same sound I'd heard once before, that rough, questioning meow. But this time she didn't stop. She meowed again and again, each one softer, more drawn out, until it didn't sound like a call anymore. It sounded like a memory. I crouched down beside her, my knees pressing into the damp wood. The dog stood at my other side, close enough that I could feel the warmth from his body. "What is it, girl?" I whispered. The words came out quieter than I intended, almost like I was afraid of being overheard. And then, from the dark beneath the hedge, came the smallest reply. Not quite a meow, not quite a cry. Something in between, high-pitched, hesitant and impossibly fragile. I leaned forward, my eyes straining to find the source. At first, all I saw were shadows. Then, two small glints of light reflected back at me. Not the clouded pale of her eyes, but bright, clear amber. Kittens. 2 of them. Huddled tight against the base of the fence, their tiny bodies shivering. My breath caught. She stepped closer, her paw dangling just over the edge of the porch. The dog pressed forward too, but only enough to put himself slightly between her and the drop, not blocking, just guiding. The kittens didn't move toward us. They just stared, wide-eyed, their little sides rising and falling too fast. It hit me then, the reason she'd been coming back to that corner over and over. She'd known they were there. Maybe she couldn't see them, but she'd heard them, smelled them, felt them in the way only an animal can. And the dog. He hadn't just been her guide. He'd been her protection while she tried to reach them. I don't remember making the decision to act. One second I was crouched there, heart pounding. The next, I was on my knees in the damp grass, pushing aside the brittle branches of the hedge. The kittens flinched but didn't run. They were too cold, too weak. I slid my hands gently under them, feeling the sharp little bones under their fur. They didn't weigh anything. They barely moved. When I brought them onto the porch, she leaned forward instantly, sniffing them from head to tail. Her movements were urgent but careful. She licked one kitten's head, then the other, her rough tongue making a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. The dog stood close, his head lowered, sniffing them once before settling back into his watchful stance. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat making it impossible to speak. It wasn't just that we'd found them. It was the realization that she'd been trying for weeks to get to them, and that every single visit, every pause, every turn of her head toward that corner had been her way of telling me they were there. I just hadn't understood. I went inside, grabbed an old blanket and set it down on the porch. She stepped onto it immediately, curling her body protectively around the kittens. The dog lay beside her, pressing his side against hers like he was sealing the little family into a safe circle. I sat down opposite them, my back against the wall, and let the tears come. Not loud, not messy, just the quiet kind you don't bother to hide. Because, for the first time since losing my dad and Daisy and so much else, I didn't feel like I was sitting in the ruins of something. I felt like I was sitting at the start. If you've ever had an animal show you something you didn't know you were missing, you'll understand why I stayed there until the cold had numbed my hands just watching them breathe. By the time I finally went inside, they were still there, the cat's head resting on the dog's paw, the kittens tucked into the warm space between them. And I knew, whatever happened next, I couldn't just let them walk away again. Because sometimes love doesn't come to your door asking for shelter. Sometimes it stands in the driveway for weeks, waiting patiently, until you're finally ready to follow it where it's been trying to lead you all along. The night had fallen heavier than ever before. The darkness inside the crumbling orphanage wasn't just the absence of light. It felt like a living thing, pressing against our skin, breathing in our ears and whispering in a language no human was meant to understand. The air smelled of wet earth, old blood, and something far older, something that had been waiting here long before any of us were born. I clutched the candle, its trembling flame the only fragile barrier between us and the abyss around. Beside me, the blind cat padded forward with unnatural confidence, her head low, ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. Every step echoed as though the building itself was hollow, swallowing our movements into an endless void. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, as if they were made of flesh and breathing in unison with something deep inside. Why are we going deeper? My voice cracked, barely above a whisper. The cat didn't answer, of course. She never did, with words. Instead, her tail flicked sharply toward the hallway ahead, a signal. I followed. We reached a long, narrow corridor. Both sides were covered in rows of photographs, children, smiling awkwardly, all framed neatly. Beneath each picture was a name, carefully engraved into tarnished metal plaques. At first they seemed ordinary, until I noticed the eyes. Every single child's pupils were scratched out, gouged away by something sharp. Not painted over, carved, froze, staring at one frame that felt wrong. The photo showed a boy, maybe 8 years old, wearing the same uniform I'd seen in that faded group picture earlier. His smile was wide, almost too wide. The engraving beneath read, Ethan Hale, returned. The word returned wasn't like the others. It was freshly scratched in, the metal edges still raw, glinting faintly in the candlelight. I swallowed. Returned? Returned to what? The cat stopped in front of another frame. This one, my blood ran cold. It was me. Same face, same messy hair, wearing the same jacket I had on right now. But I didn't remember ever taking this photo. Beneath it, the plaque read, Returned. The name section was blank, as if never meant to be spoken aloud. I took a step back. That's impossible. The cat hissed. Not at me, but at the photograph. Her tail fluffed out, and for the first time she looked genuinely unsettled. The corridor suddenly felt narrower, the shadows at the edges twitching like they were holding something back. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping. Faint at first, like nails against wood. Then louder. Faster. Coming from inside the walls themselves. Tap, 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 tap. It traveled up the corridor walls, the sound darting between the photographs, stopping right behind mine. I stared at my photo. The scratched-out eyes seemed deeper now, like holes. Something moved inside them. The candle flickered violently. I swore I saw a finger, thin, pale, impossibly long, slip out from one of the eye sockets in the photograph. The finger twitched, curling toward me like it was beckoning. I stumbled back, nearly tripping. The cat yowled, a sound sharp enough to slice through the thick air, and bolted ahead. I had no choice but to follow her, my breath quickening as the tapping erupted into frantic pounding. The walls shook. We burst through a doorway and into a large room, an old nursery. Rows of tiny metal beds lined the walls, their frames rusted, mattresses long rotted away. The moonlight leaked in through cracked windows, casting pale blue shadows. At the far end of the room stood a rocking chair. It moved gently back and forth, though there was no wind. I didn't want to look at it. Every nerve in my body told me not to look, but my eyes betrayed me. Sitting in the chair was a figure. It looked like an old woman at first glance, thin, hunched, hair hanging in greasy strands. But her face wasn't right. The skin was too tight over the skull, the lips torn back into a permanent grin that showed dry, cracked teeth. Her eyes were the worst, milky white, but shifting, like something was swimming just beneath the surface. In her lap, oh God, In her lap were tiny broken dolls. Dozens of them, each missing their eyes. She rocked slowly, humming a lullaby that made my stomach churn. It wasn't a song meant to comfort. It was meant to call something. The cat froze beside me, her ears flat, tail low. Then, without warning, she darted toward the left wall and began scratching at it frantically. I didn't understand until the rocking stopped. The old woman's head turned, not like a person's, but like an owl's, twisting too far, bones cracking. She didn't blink. She didn't move. Then her grin widened, skin tearing at the corners. Returned, she whispered, her voice like dry leaves. I bolted toward where the cat was clawing, and that's when I saw it. A small, square, hatch in the wall. Barely noticeable, but just big enough for a person to crawl through. The pounding from the corridor was growing louder. Something was coming. The woman rose from the chair. Her movements were slow, deliberate, her head still tilted unnaturally. As she stepped forward, I realized her feet weren't touching the ground. The cat darted into the hatch without hesitation. I dropped to my knees, pulling the cover open, the rusted hinges screaming in protest. The air inside was cold, too cold. I crawled in. The passage was narrow, forcing me onto my elbows. The candlelight bounced off the damp wooden walls, revealing strange carvings, circles, spirals, and jagged lines that seemed to writhe if I stared. Too long. Behind me, the woman's voice slithered through the air. You don't have to run, you've already returned. The cat was ahead, her movements quick and silent. Every few feet she'd pause and glance back, making sure I was still following. The pounding from the corridor had stopped. But something else had started. A scraping sound, long and slow, like nails being dragged across metal. It was coming from directly behind me in the crawl space. I didn't dare look. The tunnel ended abruptly, opening into a small square room lit only by a single flickering bulb. And the walls, oh God, the walls. They were covered in eyes. Not painted, not carved, real eyes. Hundreds of them, embedded into the wood, each, one wet and moving. They rolled in their sockets, focusing on me the moment I entered. Some blinked, some wept. Some just stared, unblinking. In the center of the room was a single object, a child's wooden coffin, small enough to fit on a table. The lid was half open. The cat leapt onto it and stared at me with a look that was almost human. She wanted me to open it. With trembling hands, I lifted the lid. Inside wasn't a body. It was a mirror, but it didn't reflect me. Instead, I saw the orphanage, but not as it was now. I saw it alive, full of children running and laughing. I saw the woman from the nursery, smiling kindly, holding the blind cat in her arms. Then the image shifted. The children began disappearing one by one. Shadows replaced them. The woman's smile twisted into the grotesque grin I had seen earlier. Her eyes turned milky. The last thing in the mirror was me, not now, years ago, a child standing in the nursery, holding the cat. Then the image faded. The cat yowled loudly, and the walls of eyes began to blink rapidly, their gaze shifting toward the crawlspace entrance. The scraping sound returned, louder, closer. Something was coming through the tunnel. Grabbed the coffin and the mirror inside, though I didn't know why. The cat darted toward a corner of the room where a section of the wall looked weaker. She began clawing at it furiously. The wood cracked, splintered, and then gave way, revealing a drop into blackness. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying with it the stench of earth and decay. The scraping was almost in the room now. The cat leapt into the darkness. Without thinking, I followed. We fell onto damp soil. The air was suffocating, thick with rot. As I stood, I realized we were in a massive underground chamber, walls of stone, roots hanging like skeletal fingers. Shapes moved in the dark, small shapes. Children. But their faces were wrong, eyes missing, mouths sewn shut. They shuffled toward me in silence, their hands outstretched. The cat stood between us, her fur bristling, her blind eyes fixed on the largest shape emerging from the shadows. It was the woman. Her body stretched unnaturally now, limbs too long, fingers dragging on the ground. Her head hung low, the grin splitting her face in half. "You've returned," she said again. Only this time, it wasn't a statement. It was a sentence. I don't remember the next moments clearly. I remember the cat leaping onto her face. Claws, digging in deep. The woman's scream was not human, it was a sound that rattled my bones. I remember running, finding a narrow passage in the stone and squeezing through until the air turned fresh again. I remember emerging into the cold night outside, the orphanage far behind me. But the cat never followed. Now, nights feel different. Sometimes when the wind is still, I hear her meow outside my window, soft, distant, but always getting closer. And I know that one night I'll open the door and she'll guide me back, because you can escape a place. But you can't escape once you've returned.